Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 26 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, Georg and his companions attended a royal gathering in Porea, where the Tahitian nobles vied for gifts with charm, cunning, and touching appeals. Older women asked for beads like loving mothers, while the youth relied on flattery and beauty to win favor. In return, the islanders gifted fine cloths scented with oil, draping the visitors until they could hardly move. King O2 remained dignified, while questions arose about former visitors like Banks, Solander, and Tupaia. A bagpipe performance surprised and delighted the court, earning praise and gifts. Back at the ship, the crew faced an endless flow of curious islanders, prompting a retreat to the shore. Their observations resumed, but the night brought a change. Women of low rank stayed aboard after sunset, seeking beads and tools in exchange for favors, turning the ship into a scene resembling Spithead. The next morning, King O2 brought gifts to both ships, and, after the usual ceremony, visited the adventure. His sister joined Cook's vessel, and the young noble Potatau received royal honors. The captains then escorted the siblings back to Porea, setting the stage for a deeper exploration of Tahiti's interior.
Sunday, August 29th, 1773, Tahiti.
During the crew's absence, the two captains had visited the king in Porea. In their honor, a dramatic dance performance had been held, in which Her Royal Highness Tauraï played the leading role. She appeared in the same attire and performed with the same style of pantomime as previously described during Captain Cook's first voyage. Two male performers danced during the intervals while the princess rested. These men also sang or spoke a few words with exaggerated grimaces, which apparently related to the theme of the dance, though the foreign audience could not understand their meaning. The entire performance lasted about 90 minutes, and Princess Tauraï displayed an extraordinary level of skill, surpassing anything the visitors had seen on the previous voyage to Ulietea. The next morning, Captain Cook sent Lieutenant Pickersgill to the southwestern part of the island early, tasked with purchasing fresh provisions, especially pigs, since the king had provided only 2 so far. Meanwhile, Georg and the others stayed on board the whole day to describe the plants they had collected the day before. At 10 o'clock that night, a loud commotion broke out on the beach opposite the ship. The captains immediately suspected some connection to their own men and promptly dispatched boats with officers to investigate. They soon returned with several Marines and a sailor who had gone ashore with permission but failed to return on time and had ended up beating an islander. The captain ordered them put in chains right away, understanding how vital it was to punish such offenses to maintain peaceful relations with the locals. O2 had promised to come aboard the next morning with his father, but hearing of the disturbance half an hour later made him suspicious. Instead, he sent one of his chief attendants, named Itai, as an envoy to explain his absence. By that time, Dr. Sparman and Georg had already returned to shore and set out for the spot where the incident had occurred, intending to head further inland. They met the peaceful Ohua on the beach, who expressed his dismay about the previous night's events. The two assured him that they were equally upset, that the offenders were already in irons and would be severely punished. This reassured him completely. As no one had come with them from the ship, they asked Owa for someone trustworthy to carry their equipment. Several men volunteered, but Owa chose a strong and capable man who was given a sack for the plants and a few baskets filled with Tahitian apples they had just acquired. Thus accompanied, they crossed over One Tree Hill and reached one of the lower valleys of Opar. There, fortune favored them with a botanical discovery, a new tree of extraordinary beauty, adorned with large white blossoms, as radiant as lilies. Each bloom had a tuft of stamens tipped in a brilliant carmine red. So many flowers had already fallen that the ground beneath the tree was covered with them. They named this beautiful tree Barringtonia. In the local language, it was called huddu. The islanders claimed that if the nut-like fruit of this tree was crushed and mixed with shellfish meat before being thrown into the sea, the fish would be so stunned that they would float to the surface and could be caught by hand. It was remarkable that several marine plants between the tropics shared this same property. Among them were the so-called Cocculi indici, well known in East India and used for the same purpose. Georg and his companion were far too delighted by this botanical discovery to wait until their return to the ship to study it further. So, without hesitation, they entered a charming house made of reeds, surrounded by fragrant shrubs and a few coconut palms. In line with the island's famed hospitality, the homeowner immediately sent a boy up one of the tallest palms to fetch coconuts for the visitors. The lad performed the task with remarkable skill. He tied a strip of tough banana fiber around both his feet, just long enough to encircle the trunk, which served as a foothold while he pulled himself upward with his hands. The natural structure of the coconut palm, which forms a thick ring on its trunk each year, made climbing easier. Yet the speed and grace with which the boy moved remained impressive. Georg and his companion would have been undeserving of such kindness and attentiveness had they not offered a small gift to their host upon leaving and rewarded the boy for his agility. From there they continued up the valley, which, unlike the usual pattern, had no stream running through its center and sloped gently upward toward the mountains. On the left it was bordered by a steep hill which they had resolved to climb, despite its daunting incline. The effort soon took its toll, and Georg and his companion found themselves constantly stopping to catch their breath, to the amusement of their Tahitian guide, who chuckled as they sat down again and again. Behind them, they heard the man breathing deeply through his open mouth as he slowly climbed. Trying to imitate what nature had seemingly taught their companion, the travelers adjusted their breathing accordingly, and indeed found it more effective than the shallow gasps they had used before. Eventually, they reached the summit, where the terrain leveled out and a refreshing breeze cooled their exhausted bodies. They walked further along the high plateau until the blazing heat, reflected from the dry earth, forced them to rest in the shade of a lone screw pine, or pandanus tree. Their guide, too, welcomed the pause. The view from that spot was superb. Far below lay the plain of Matavai, stretching out its charms before them. The bay, encircled by the reef of Tahiti, sparkled with canoes and anchored ships. The midday sun cast a steady and serene light across the whole scene. About 33 kilometers, 20.5 miles away, they spotted the low-lying island of Tetiaroa, a small circle of coral rocks topped with palms, beyond which the vista dissolved into the open ocean. Although the other neighboring islands remained hidden from view, the Tahitian guide pointed out their locations and described what grew there, whether they were mountainous or flat, inhabited or visited only occasionally. Tetiaroa belonged to the latter group, and 2 canoes with raised sails were just now returning from there. According to the islander, they had likely been out fishing, as the enclosed waters around the island were especially rich in marine life. After a short rest, the group pressed onward, heading toward the forested interior mountains. These peaks enticed them not only with the promise of lush greenery and potential new botanical discoveries, but also with their deceptive nearness. Yet the travelers soon realized the opposite was true. A succession of dry hills and valleys still lay between them and their goal, making it clear that they would not reach those distant heights that day. They had thought about spending the night on the way, but after careful consideration, the group found it unwise. No one knew exactly when Captain Cook planned to set sail, and they were not equipped with any provisions. Moreover, their Tahitian companion warned them that they would find neither people, houses, nor food up in the mountains. It would be better, he advised, to return to the Matavai Valley using a narrow footpath he pointed out. Following his advice, they began the descent. But it turned out to be even more treacherous than the climb up had been. The group stumbled constantly, and at some spots, they were forced to sit down and slide. Their shoes had become slick from walking on dry grass, making the path more dangerous than for their barefoot guide, who moved with far greater confidence. To free their hands, Georg and his companion handed the birding guns to their guide. Later, they took the weapons back, let the islander lead the way, and leaned on his arms when the path was particularly steep. About halfway down, the guide called out to some people in the valley below. At first, they thought no one had heard him. There was no reply, but it wasn't long before a few islanders appeared, climbing up quickly. Within less than half an hour, they reached the group and brought with them 3 fresh coconuts. To Georg and the others, they tasted better than any they had ever tried. Whether they truly were, or whether their exhaustion simply made them seem that way, he couldn't tell. The locals insisted that the travelers rest a while and promised a whole stockpile of coconuts further down the slope. They had only brought a few ahead to make sure the visitors wouldn't drink too quickly. Their thoughtfulness was deeply appreciated, though thirst made it hard to wait. Finally, the group set off again and soon reached a beautiful little grove on level ground. There, lying in the fresh grass, they enjoyed the cool nectar their new friends had brought them. This refreshing break restored their strength, and with renewed energy, the group continued down into the valley. Soon, a crowd of islanders gathered, all eager to accompany the visitors across the plain toward the sea. Just as they were preparing to set off, a well-dressed man appeared alongside his daughter, a 16-year-old girl, and invited the group to his house, which lay further upstream, to share a meal. Although Georg and his companions were so exhausted that they would have preferred to decline the offer, they did not want to offend the host's kindness and agreed to follow him. The path stretched for about 3.2 kilometers, 2 miles, winding along the magnificent banks of the Matavai River, through groves of coconut, breadfruit, apple, and mulberry trees, interspersed with fields of banana and taro. Throughout the valley, the river crossed the path in several places, often forcing them to wade through the water. But their host and his attendants insisted on carrying the travelers on their backs across every ford. Eventually, they arrived at the man's house, which stood atop a small hill, beside a stream that flowed gently over a bed of pebbles. Preparations for the meal were quickly made. In one corner of the house, a beautiful mat was spread on the ground, and the host's relatives gathered around it. His daughter, more finely built, fair-skinned and graceful than nearly any Tahitian woman they had yet seen, captured everyone's attention. She and her young companion spared no effort in trying to please their guests. To ease the visitors' drowsy fatigue, the girls employed their soft hands to gently massage Georg and the other's arms and thighs. They softly pressed the muscles between their fingers in a motion that felt both caring and skilled. The effect was remarkable. Whether it improved blood circulation in their finer vessels or instantly restored elasticity to tired muscles, Georg did not know. But the group quickly revived, and within a short time felt no trace of their earlier exhaustion. Captain Wallace also recalled this local practice and praised its beneficial effects based on his own experience. Osbeck, in his account of a journey to China, remarked that this form of treatment was very common there as well, and that Chinese barbers in particular were especially skilled in performing it. In addition, Gross's description of travels in East India contains a detailed report of an art known among the inhabitants as tsjamping, a practice that appears to be a sensual refinement of the same invigorating method. Gross even cited passages from Martial and Seneca to support the likely conclusion that the Romans too must have been familiar with this technique. They no longer had any reason to complain about a lack of appetite, which had only troubled them earlier due to fatigue. As soon as the meal was served, which in line with the locals' simple way of life consisted solely of fruits and roots, they eagerly began to eat, and found themselves, after finishing the meal, as refreshed as they had been in the early morning. After spending nearly 2 hours with this hospitable family, the guests gave generous gifts to their kind host, his beautiful daughter, and her friends, whose attentive care had so effectively restored their strength. They offered as much as their supply of glass beads, nails, and knives allowed. Around 3 o'clock, they took their leave. On their way back, the travelers passed by many houses whose residents were lying together in groups beneath the shade of fruit trees, enjoying the pleasant afternoon as a shared moment of rest. In one of the houses, they noticed a man busy preparing a red dye, which the Tahitians used to color cloth made from the bark of the Chinese mulberry tree. To their surprise, the vibrant crimson hue was achieved using only the yellow sap of a small fig species, called mati, and the green juice of a fern or other local herb. Simply mixing these two produced the intense red. When a uniform color was desired, women would rub the mixture directly onto the fabric with their hands. For speckled or patterned designs, they dipped a bamboo tube into the liquid and pressed it onto the cloth in different directions. Though this dye was very delicate, it couldn't withstand moisture, not even rain, and faded quickly just from exposure to air. The dyed garments were highly valued. Only members of the upper class wore them. In exchange for nails and glass beads, the guests purchased several pieces in different styles and then returned to their tents, which lay at least 5 kilometers from the place where they had dined. There they bid farewell to their trustworthy guide, a man recommended to them by Oahu. He had served them with a level of honesty and integrity that far exceeded expectations, especially in a culture where petty theft was common. His conduct was all the more admirable given how many chances he had to run off with their nails and guns during the journey. It would have taken an unusual degree of moral integrity to resist such temptation. As a reward, they gave him a pair of glass beads. Finally, they were ferried back to the ship in a canoe. While Georg and the others had been away, Captain Cook and Georg's father had taken a walk westward. They had just returned on board when they shared what had happened in their absence. Shortly after the group had left that morning, a man named E.T. had come to them as an envoy of the king. He had brought a pig and fruits as a gift for the captain, but also delivered a message. Otu, upset by the events of the previous day, had become matau, that is, afraid, and was now distrustful of them. To demonstrate that they themselves did not approve of the misconduct committed by their crew, the captain ordered the guilty men to be brought on deck. In front of E.T. and the assembled Tahitians, each was publicly given 12 lashes. The sight was meant as a warning. After the punishment, Cook had 3 sheep, some of the last from the batch purchased at the Cape, brought into the boat. Accompanied by Captain Furneaux and Georg's father, he went ashore again to rebuild trust with the king, without which no provisions could be obtained in the region. When they reached Porea, they were told the king had left for the west. The group followed him for 4 or 5 more kilometers and finally landed in a district called Titaha, where they waited several hours. Otu had fled 9 kilometers inland from Matavai Bay, so great was his fear of them. While this panic might have seemed cowardly, it was understandable given how violently and brutally Europeans had once asserted their power over the islanders. By the time the king arrived with his mother, it was already 3 in the afternoon. He was still full of fear and suspicion, while she appeared with tears in her eyes. However, once Itai reported that the offenders had been punished in his presence, Otu began to calm down, and when Captain Cook, repeating his assurances of friendship, presented him with a new kind of animal, the sheep, the king's trust was finally restored. At His Majesty's request, the Highlander among the crew had to play the bagpipes once again. Though the Scotsman's skill was modest, the instrument's effect on the Tahitian king was as powerful as David's harp had once been on Saul's gloom. The power of the music made itself known almost immediately. The king ordered a pig to be brought and gave it to Captain Cook as a gift. Soon after, he had a second pig delivered for Captain Furneaux. As both commanders planned to depart from the island soon and assumed this might be their last chance to receive royal gifts, they requested that His Majesty also give something to Matara, Georg's father. The request was granted, though it was only a small piglet. When the men showed signs of disappointment about the lesser gift, one of the king's male relatives, referred to as Medua, meaning father, stepped forward from the crowd. With grand gestures and a loud voice, he addressed the king, pointing alternately to the visitors, the sheep that had been given, and the piglet. No sooner had the speaker finished than the small piglet was taken away and replaced with a full-grown pig. In return for this generosity, the Europeans distributed various iron tools and other small items. The Tahitians reciprocated by offering a hau, pieces of fine local cloth, with which they dressed the guests. After taking leave of the entire royal court, the visitors returned to the ships around 5 o'clock in the evening. Since the captain planned to leave the island entirely the next day, preparations for departure were made. As soon as the islanders saw these arrangements, whose meaning they well understood from previous visits, they came rushing in one last time with heaps of fish, shells, fruits, and cloth, eager to trade. Everything was taken. Lieutenant Pickersgill, who had been away from the ship since the day before yesterday to procure provisions, returned from his expedition around 3 p.m. that afternoon. He had traveled beyond the fertile plains of Papara, where O'Amo, the former king of all Tahiti, was staying with his son, the young Teridaire. The first night, the lieutenant had spent in a small district currently ruled by the well-known queen, Porea. As soon as she was informed of his arrival, she came to greet him warmly, remembering him as an old friend. Since Captain Wallace's departure, she had separated from her husband and had fallen from the power and fame that once made her name known both in Tahitian and European accounts. Her decline was mainly due to the civil wars between Tahiti's two peninsulas, which had caused great ruin to her and the district of Papara. She complained to the lieutenant that she was tete, poor, and could not even afford to give a pig to her European friends. Seeing no gifts could be expected from her, he returned to Papara the next morning and visited her former husband, Amo, who had since married one of the most beautiful young women on the island. Amo himself had grown old and inactive. The young woman, however, gifted the visitors a pig and decided to accompany them when they departed. She brought along some of her female attendants and confidently spent the day in their boat, while her own canoe followed alongside to take her home again. She seemed extremely curious and had probably never seen Europeans before. Among other things, she even questioned whether they were physically the same as her own people, until her doubts were fully dispelled by direct inspection. Together with this unexpected companion, the group arrived at Atahuru, where a respected chief named Potatau received them warmly and gave them shelter for the second night. He too had separated from his wife Polatahera and taken a younger partner. Polatahera, in turn, had found a new lover or husband, yet despite these changes, all four lived together under one roof as peacefully as ever. The next morning, Potatau told Mr. Pickersgill that he would gladly accompany him to Matavai to visit Captain Cook, if only he could be sure of being well received. Mr. Pickersgill assured him that he could promise as much with confidence. Still, to be extra certain, Potatau took out a pair of yellow feathers, tied them together into a small bundle, and asked the Englishman to hold them in his hand while declaring, "Toot, Captain Cook will be Potatau's friend." Once this oath was spoken, Potatau carefully wrapped the feathers in a piece of Tahitian cloth and tucked them into his turban. They already knew from previous voyages that the islanders used red and yellow feathers in their religious practices, but that such a ceremonial gesture was used as a solemn vow revealed to them for the first time that these people clearly possessed a concept of oaths. Potatau seemed to place enormous trust in this act, and he must have believed fully in the honesty it guaranteed, for he immediately set out with his wives and several attendants, who carried pigs and bundles of cloth, heading toward Mr. Pickersgill's boat. But as soon as he reached the shore, surrounded by a large crowd, everyone pleaded with him not to go. Some even threw themselves at his feet and clung to his knees to stop him. Women cried out in tears, shouting again and again that Toot would kill him the moment he stepped aboard the ship. An older man, likely a long-time servant of Potatau's family, grabbed his clothes and tried to pull him back. Potatau was visibly moved. He looked concerned for a moment, but quickly gathered himself, pushed the old man aside, and called out boldly, "Tute aipa mat te tayo," meaning, "Cook will not kill his friend." With that, he jumped into the boat with a proud and fearless confidence that the Englishman deeply admired. Once on board, he went straight below deck with his current wife, Waini Au, his former wife, and her new lover, all to present their gifts to Captain Cook. Potatau was one of the tallest men the English had seen on the island, and his facial features radiated kindness, dignity, and majesty. So much so that Mr. Hodges immediately began sketching him as one of the noblest models nature had to offer. The entire figure of this man was remarkably impressive, his limbs especially strong and well-formed. His thigh, for instance, was as thick as the torso of their strongest sailor. The flowing garments he wore, along with his elegant white turban, suited his build perfectly. His noble and open demeanor pleased the Englishman immensely, especially in contrast to the suspicious nature of O2. Polatahera, Potatau's first wife, matched him in both height and stoutness. In this regard, she struck the visitors as the most unusual woman they had ever seen. Both her appearance and her bearing were distinctly masculine. The very idea of power and authority seemed embodied in her presence. During the previous visit of the Endeavour, she had given proof of that spirit. Back then, she had declared herself to be Captain Cook's sister, Tuahini no Toot. When a sentry at Point Venus refused to let her into the fort, despite that claim, she struck the guard down and went straight to her adopted brother to complain about the insult she had suffered. They had not been on board long when they learned that the ship was preparing to set sail immediately. With every expression of sincere friendship and with tears in their eyes, the Tahitian guests asked whether the crew would ever return to their island. Captain Cook promised to come back in 7 months. That assurance seemed to satisfy them. Calmly, they bid their farewells and left in their canoes, which had followed the ship to the anchorage, heading westward toward their home. Meanwhile, a young Tahitian of humble origin arrived with his father. He was well-formed, around 17 years old, and had already told the captain a few days earlier that he wanted to travel Note Venua te Bretagne, to the land of Britain. His entire outfit consisted of a narrow piece of cloth tied around his waist. In this utterly defenseless and dependent state, he entrusted himself to the crew's care and protection without the slightest hesitation. His father was a man of middle age. Captain Cook gave him a hatchet and a few lesser gifts, whereupon the man calmly stepped back into his canoe, showing no sign of sorrow at parting from his son. But as soon as the ship had passed the reef, a canoe followed, carrying 2 or 3 islanders, who demanded the boy's return in the name of King Otu. They brought some pieces of cloth as a gift in exchange, but they could not produce the iron tools that had been given to the young man. Because of that, their plea was rejected, and they had to leave without success. The boy, whose name was Porea, spoke at length with them from the stern of the ship. They seemed to do all they could to convince him to come back. He was even warned that he would die if he stayed with the foreigners. Still, their threats didn't shake his resolve. Yet as the canoe departed for the island, he couldn't help but gaze after his companions with longing. Overcome by sorrow, he finally burst into tears. To comfort him, the officers brought him into the cabin. There, in deep distress, he lamented that he would surely die, and that his father would mourn him bitterly. Captain Cook and Georg's father consoled him, and promised to care for him as if they were his own parents. On hearing this, the boy threw his arms around them, kissed and embraced them, and in an instant, his despair turned into joy and cheerfulness. At sunset, he ate his supper and lay down on the cabin floor. But when he saw that the others had not yet gone to sleep, he got up again and stayed with them until they too had finished their meal.
This concludes part 26 of Georg Forster's journey aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. If you'd like to explore the route of this episode, check out the map linked in the show notes. For those curious to see what these places look like today, I invite you to visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I travel in Forster's footsteps and uncover the connections between past and present. That was episode 26 of our voyage with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the Resolution. Our journey continues in the next episode. Until then, life is a journey, being part of it is everything.